That was the only sound coming from Sector 4's agricultural bay. Just the rhythmic snap of a thick rubber band against a human's wrist. I hated that sound. Orbital Farm 4 was supposed to be a quiet assignment for a security analyst. It was a massive, humid cylinder spinning on the edge of the system, dedicated entirely to hydroponic yields, atmospheric scrubbers, and the occasional rogue fungus. But Command had recently approved the requisition of Terran laborers to manage the deeproot crops. They claimed Earth agriculture bred unparalleled endurance. I just saw a species that looked entirely too comfortable in a gravity well that made my own exoskeleton ache with a dull, persistent throb. Zane was 50 local cycles old, though his face looked like it had been carved from dried river clay. He was currently shoulder-deep in a thicket of razorvine, pruning the toxic barbs without wearing his issued polymesh gauntlets. He just grabbed them. Snap. He pulled a dead stalk loose. Snap. He shifted his grip. I adjusted my monitors, my mandibles clicking in unease. I had read the file on Earth's gravity. I knew about the atmospheric density that compressed their biology into dense, coiled springs, which meant the station's atmospheric stabilizers were operating at peak efficiency. It was just him. He made the room feel heavy. If you have never watched a Terran work, I suggest you pay close attention to what happened next. The bay doors hissed open. 3 figures stepped through the atmospheric seal, casting long, distorted shadows across the nutrient beds. Corvith and his squad. Station security technically reported to the central lattice, but down in the agricultural rings, Corvith ran his own operation. He was a brute of a Velotian, thick-plated and entirely too fond of his high-voltage stun baton. He liked shaking down the new hires. A credit here, a ration pack there. It was a petty, miserable little fiefdom, and I usually looked the other way. My job was observing, not intervening. Corvith swaggered down the central aisle, his 2 deputies flanking him. Their heavy boots crushed the fallen razorvine leaves, a deliberate display of disrespect in a sterile zone. Zane didn't look up. He just reached higher into the canopy, his thick, calloused fingers wrapping around a thorny primary stem. Earth dirt was notoriously unyielding. Pulling roots from it for decades had given him a grip strength that defied logic. Hey, dirt scraper. Corvith tapped his baton against a delicate nutrient vat. The metal rang out harsh and aggressive. We're collecting the sector tax. New arrivals pay double. Zane shifted his weight. He didn't speak. He just kept working the shears with his right hand, pulling the stubborn vines clear with his left. Corvith's dermal plates flushed a dark, angry violet. Velotians demanded absolute acknowledgement. Being ignored by a soft-skinned mammalian was an insult that required immediate physical correction. I said, Corvith snarled, stepping directly into Zane's peripheral vision. You owe the tax. I leaned closer to the feed, my anxiety spiking. I had watched Zane earlier that cycle. A pressurized irrigation line had blown a gasket, sending a jagged piece of shrapnel straight into his forearm. I watched him pull a metal fragment from his own arm. He didn't stop talking to the botanist beside him. He hadn't even winced. Corvith didn't know that. One of the deputies, a twitchy avian named Rill, drew a thermal cutter and pointed it at the roots Zane had spent 3 hours carefully unearthing. Maybe he doesn't understand basic. Maybe we need to burn his little project to get his attention. That got a reaction. Zane stopped. He let go of the vine. The silence in the bay was sudden and absolute. He turned slowly. He wasn't a large human. Average height, maybe a bit broad in the shoulders. But the way he moved was fundamentally wrong to my eyes. There was no wasted energy. No posturing. It was the movement of a creature that had spent its entire existence fighting a planet that actively wanted it dead, just to pull calories from the dirt. Snap. Zane pulled the thick rubber band on his wrist back, letting it strike his skin. It was a nervous habit I had assumed, a mundane little action to channel excess energy. Now, seeing the flat, dead expression in his eyes, I realized it was something else entirely. It was a tether. "The plants," Zane said, his voice a low, gravelly rumble that barely registered on my audio pickups, "are fragile. Step back from the beds." Corvith laughed. It was a barking, ugly sound that echoed off the glass ceiling. "Or what? You'll throw fertilizer at us?" He raised the stun baton, setting it to maximum discharge. The air immediately hummed with the electric charge, ozone mixing with the smell of damp earth and chlorophyll. Corvith stepped fully into Zane's workspace, bringing the baton down toward the human's unprotected shoulder with bone-breaking force. I reached for the emergency alert toggle. I didn't want to log a corpse on my shift, but the baton never landed. Zane's left hand moved. He did not attempt to block the descending weapon. He did not flinch away from the crackling electrical charge. He simply caught Corvith's thick, armored wrist in midair, halting the heavy strike completely dead in its tracks. The kinetic impact sent a visible shudder through the floor grates. Up in the security observation booth, my secondary cup of lukewarm StimCAF tipped over across the main console, the brown liquid rippling violently against the diagnostic screens. I ignored it, my primary eyes locked on the live feed. He just squeezed. Corvith's roar of predatory fury mutated instantly into a high-pitched, breathless squeal. Velashan bone plating is biologically engineered to withstand heavy kinetic impacts, blunt force trauma, and deep lacerations from territorial rivals. But it was absolutely not designed for sustained, localized, crushing compression. Zane twisted his grip, applying the exact same leverage he had been using all morning to uproot the stubborn, deep soil tubers. The high-voltage stun baton slipped from numb, paralyzed fingers and clattered harmlessly onto the metal grating, its power cell winding down into silence. It is a documented scientific fact that Terran biology, having evolved alongside apex predators with massive bite forces and vegetation that actively resists cultivation, possesses a musculoskeletal density that makes their physical joints operate like industrial locking mechanisms when fully engaged. Corvith dropped heavily to his knees, his massive, terrifying frame folding completely under the pressure of a single human hand. The third guard, a scaled reptilian enforcer who had been blocking the main aisle, hissed and charged. Zane did not even drop his pruning shears. He sidestepped the attack with the weary, irritated grace of a man who had spent decades dodging aggressive livestock. As the reptilian lunged past him, Zane reached out, grabbed the heavy utility webbing on the guard's back, shifted his center of gravity, and redirected all of that forward momentum straight into an empty compost vat. The enforcer went in headfirst. Only his thick, scaled tail remained visible, thrashing uselessly against the slick, durasteel sides as he struggled to free himself from the dense, rotting vegetation. The human wasn't fighting. I realized with a sudden spike of anxious clarity he was simply pruning. He was removing invasive pests from his designated garden beds, treating armored security personnel with the exact same mild annoyance he reserved for the razor vines. The twitchy avian deputy, Rill, panicked completely. He dropped his thermal cutter, his feathers puffing out in pure, unfiltered terror. He bolted backward toward the sector control panel, his sharp talons smashing frantically against the emergency quarantine sequence. Warning klaxons immediately began to blare. The massive, interlocking bulkheads of Sector 4 slammed shut with a definitive, ground-shaking thud, sealing the bay entirely. Rill scrambled away from the console, putting a massive, reinforced nutrient vat between himself and the gardener. "You are dead," Rill shrieked, his voice echoing shrilly in the enclosed space. "You assaulted a commanding officer. When the central backup squad arrives here, they will vent this entire room into the void." Zane finally released Corvith's wrist, letting the hulking Velashan commander slump, groaning onto the damp floor. The human wiped his hands on his dirt-stained trousers. He looked calmly at the sealed bulkhead doors. Then he tilted his head back and looked at the manual override switch. The switch was positioned extremely high on the far wall, nested directly beneath the ceiling ventilation ducts. It was completely inaccessible from the ground floor without a motorized maintenance ladder. Zane sighed, a heavy, tired sound. He reached into his cargo pocket and pulled out a heavy steel hex nut, likely scavenged from the blown irrigation line he had repaired earlier that cycle. Then he slid the thick rubber band off his wrist. I leaned so close to the monitor that my breath fogged the glass. The band was no longer a mundane nervous habit. He hooked the rubber loop securely over his left thumb and forefinger, creating a rigid Y shape with his own flesh and bone. He pinched the heavy steel hex nut into the center of the band and drew it back. He pulled the material far past what any standard synthetic polymer should reasonably withstand. The tension in the band vibrated visibly on the high-definition feed. Zane's eyes narrowed, measuring angle, trajectory, and atmospheric resistance in a fraction of a second. It was an application of rudimentary physics that bordered on the absurd. He released the tension. The hex nut crossed the agricultural bay at a velocity my sensors struggled to track. It struck the manual override button with a resounding, metallic crack. The red quarantine lights instantly switched to a calm green. The massive bulkheads hissed, depressurized, and slowly slid apart, completely ruining Rill's tactical hostage situation. The avians stared blankly at the open doorway, then looked back at Zane in utter disbelief. "Leave," Zane said quietly. Rill did not hesitate. He scrambled frantically over Corvith, grabbed the groaning commander by his uniform collar, and dragged him backward through the open doors, leaving the compost-covered reptilian to crawl out on his own. The agricultural bay returned to its quiet, humid baseline. Zane bent down, retrieved his shears, and stepped back into the thicket of razor vines. Up in the security booth, I wiped the spilled CAF from my console and opened a direct requisition form to Central Command. The station needed exactly 4 more Terran hires. Down below, the gardener slipped a simple rubber band back onto his wrist.